Hello. This lecture will be about how parties and coalitions work. Prior to listening to this lecture, it might be helpful to look at I would call them a handout, except they're online, but a little piece of document I put up about why we have a two-party system. That should be up as a file in Unit 3 on the Blackboard website. And that will explain a little bit about why we have the persistent two-party dominant system that we have. Today this lecture will build on that slightly because it's going to talk about, given that we have a two-party system, how these parties work to make coalitions with various interest groups across the country, and therefore, conversely, how interests wind up being represented as part of the party platform. As a start for our particular conversation today, I'd like you to spend a couple of seconds thinking about what are some of the things that affect how you as an individual view politics. This can be any number of things. A number of us I know bring certain political ideas to the table because of our religious backgrounds. For others, part of how we view politics is tied to where we grew up. It might be tied to how old we are, how much experience we have. It might also be tied to our particular ethnicity. It may be tied to what socioeconomic class we are part of. It might also have something to do with how long we or our families have spent in the country. People who can trace, I had a dear friend in college who could trace her family back to one ancestor who came in on the Mayflower. She tended to have a very different political outlook than my family did because my family arrived in the country much more recently. These various things that affect how we view politics also give us some particular beliefs and interests. For example, ideas on abortion tend to be tied at least influenced by our religious affiliation. Other religions also have a very strong idea about things like the death penalty, about war. People who are Jewish in particular tend to have strong opinions about U.S. policy in the Middle East. Likewise, interestingly enough, I have friends who are Muslims sometimes also have very strong ideas about politics in the Middle East. Now, when thinking about how we have all of these ideas that come to us because of our own personal backgrounds, it's important to realize that these interests come to us first. That is, I was born black or white, I was raised Jewish or Catholic or Protestant. I was not necessarily born a Democrat or a Republican, but my own background gave me sort of an interest in certain ideas, and these interests or ideas then correlate with the interests and platforms of particular parties. That also has an important corollary, which is that particular interests did not set out to create a political party to get their interests into legislation. No matter what we may think of corporate America or of large-scale interest groups, I'm going to pick on some of the obvious ones, but, IBM or the gas industry or the banking industry did not set out to create a political party that would write legislation in their favor, even though at times it may seem that way. And there are good reasons for this. As we said, the United States has historically, for almost 2 centuries now, had the same 2 political parties in office. These 2 political parties have stayed the course even while issues have come to the fore and then faded. They have survived things like the Great Slavery debate, the Great Reconstruction debate, for that matter, things like the creation of the Social Security system. All of these were issues which were really important in their era and have sort of waned. In the case of Social Security, have come to the fore again. But the political parties have outlasted the single individual interest that sometimes form part of their platform. It's also very important to realize that though we may think some institutions are very staunchly supportive of one particular party or another, they can in fact change. And one of the best examples of this is the Catholic Church. For a very long time, people who were Catholic were somewhat assumed to be automatically democratic, in large part because a number of issues that were important to the Catholic Church, issues like support for the poor, issues like support for good education, and let's not forget that for a very long time, people who were recent arrivals in this country, first from Ireland and Italy and then from sort of Eastern Europe, tended to be Catholic, and Democrats tended to be sort of in support of a lot of conditions that were sort of in favor of new immigrants. A lot of these things meant that Catholics tended to be a very strong support base for the Democratic Party. The Catholic Church has changed their focus in the last 10, 20, 30 years, and now increasingly, because of what we would consider sort of social conservative issues, best exemplified perhaps by former Senator Rick Santorum's recent presidential campaign, people who are Catholic tend to now be, if not always, at least slightly more likely to vote Republican. And there's actually a rather interesting schism that's sort of appearing within the Catholic Church. Those who sort of support the Republicans for the sort of more social conservative issues can be Catholic, but there are also Catholics who still tend to vote for the Democrats based on things like democratic opposition to the death penalty, which is also something that's very important to Catholics. The underlying theme of this lecture, thus, has been that there are sort of two sort of things that can sort of influence. There are sort of these issues and things that are important to us as individuals that sort of influence how we vote and which politicians we want to see in office. And on the other side, there are these large political parties, which are the ones who put candidates up for office. And what I'd like to do in this lecture is sort of talk about, well, how do we bridge that gap? How do we bridge the gap between interests that individuals have and political parties? What you get is a coalition of interests which may foster or promote certain issues or values. And that these coalition interests will then promote one or more candidates or parties. They can do this politically, subtly, or they can do this rather overtly. And I'm going to go to our current sort of election cycle to sort of point this out. People have sort of noted that, for example, Mitt Romney did not necessarily need to campaign very strongly in areas that had a strong Mormon base, states like Idaho or Utah. Why? Because there's sort of this implicit assumption that people will go out and support their native son. Conversely, there are other, if you can remember the election a couple of years ago, there are other churches that will go out and basically very blatantly promote one candidate or another. So interest groups will go out and sort of throw support or promote candidates who they believe will represent them adequately. On the flip side of that is that political parties often tend to rely on the fact that certain groups will be traditionally part of the coalition that will support them and will count on them for their support. And support can take a number of different forms in this case. Perhaps most obviously, political parties will know that they can count on these people for votes. And that means that, as I sort of mentioned in the Romney example, politicians won't necessarily campaign in those areas if they can count on that support anyway. More significantly, political parties will know that certain groups that tend to be part of this coalition will support them and give them a forum for speech. This is why you will see candidates go, I'll pick on the Democrats because I've been picking on the Republicans for a while, This is why you often see Democrats going and having campaign, meet the candidate fora in things like union halls. Why you tend to see people who are advocating healthcare reform go and hold a press conference in front of a hospital, because they know that they will find in these places a forum with a friendly audience. Parties will also rely on coalitions for finances, of course, but perhaps more significantly for volunteers, for people who will help them get out the word. And they will also rely on them for suggestions and for mailings. If any of you have ever watched the news or watched political campaigns and seen candidates campaigning, and they will say, towards the end of a presidential cycle in particular, you'll see a candidate who will get up on the stage and they will generally say something like, well, I'm going to support this new idea, and then they will drag up some family and they would say, had this happen, had my proposal been in effect, this family would have been saved all kinds of money or all kinds of grief. Well, how do they know about these particular families? Often that comes from these coalitions that support the parties. Coalitions tend to be fairly stable over time. So, like I said, for a long time, unions voted for the Democrats. This was true 10 years ago. This was true 20 years ago. This was true 30 years ago. For a number of other coalitions, this tends to be true. Farm bureaus tend to vote for the Republicans. This was true 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And these coalitions, these sort of groups of interest that tend to support one party or another, will remain stable generally until you get a realignment. A realignment is a theory that was promoted in political science literature, was sort of premised started out in the 1970s. And its basic premise is that, by and large, people don't change their voting behavior that much. There are people who sort of talk about something called political formation. Those ideas and issues and values and beliefs that sort of shape who you are and what you're looking for in a government. Political scientists tend to believe that, by and large, that happens sort of early on in your life, and once that's sort of set, it's set, and it's not likely to change unless something really major happens. And what that really major thing is called a realignment. A realignment has lasting implications because it shows that the party, that one issue has caused the party to reevaluate its coalition and the things that it supports. This happens for a number of different reasons. One such thing is that there is a disruption of the existing political order because of the emergence of one or more of new or divisive issues. These are new issues that allow for no compromising. So the classic example that might be sort of relevant to all of you is the emergence of Social Security in the 1930s. The Great Recession of the 1930s created a very new issue, this huge, large-scale unemployment and poverty. There was no way to compromise on that. A few decades before that, the big issue was slavery. Again, that was what led to the Civil War. There was no compromising on that. This new and divisive issue leads to an election in which voters shift their support strongly in the favor of one party, because this new issue has caused them to sort of shift coalitions. Since this one party has now gotten a majority of the votes, it allows them to change policy through their actions. Again, think back to sort of the Great Depression and Social Security. All of these measures that came up as part of Social Security were new policies that came in part in large because of the presidency of Roosevelt and because of the things that his party was able to do because they controlled the majority of the House and the Senate. This major change in policy then leads to an enduring change in party coalitions, which works to the advantage for that time of the dominant party. So that after, for example, the Great Depression, the Democratic Party, which had previously been sort of a party that came out of the wrong side of the Civil War, became known as the party of Social Security and that type of stuff. Political scientists, by and large, believe that political party realignments come with or after major societal changes or economic disruptions. As I said, the Great Depression was one in the 1930s. The Civil War was one. There were a couple of others previously. And your book points out on page, I believe it's 256, that where these parties have and these realignments have occurred in the past. Oops, I lied. It's not 256. It's 253. If you take a look at sort of the chart at the top of page 253, it sort of shows a graphic history of the major parties. And it shows the major schisms that have affected each of these parties. Now you'll note that these schisms tended to occur every 30 to 40 years. People sort of said the effect of one long generation. And you'll note that the last one that's sort of teased out in your book is, well, interestingly, they sort of teased out two. One was the states' rights schism, which was the sort of fallout from the desegregation. The other major schism was the Wallace Schism, which doesn't have a very clear sort of line drawn to it, at least not in my book. But these both seem to occur sort of in the 1960s and 70s. Back when I was in college a number of years ago, people were arguing that we were probably due for another realignment. The great question is, where has this happened? And it's rather interesting to me as I look at your book that one of the great differences between the book that you all have now and the book that I taught with about 7 years ago, and more significantly, the book that I had when I was in college, which was far more than 7 years ago, is that when I was in college, we talked about the Great Depression being the last sort of schism and sort of the creation of sort of the welfare state. That one doesn't show up, interestingly enough, on the graphic in your book. It did show up, interestingly, in the previous one. However, in my book, when I was in college, we didn't have this states' rights schism, and I think they're sort of probably accurate in putting one there. However, even if we agree that the states' rights schism is there in the 1950s and 60s, and I would argue the Wallace Schism is probably a little bit of a result from all of that, it's still been more than 40 years since we've had a major realignment. And so there's sort of a very real and live question there about whether or not we have one, or whether we've had one, or maybe whether we're due to one. I will leave it to you all to decide whether or not we are now approaching a time, or whether we've had a time since approximately 1975, 1980, that there has been one major issue that has caused all of the parties to realign. Some people have argued that instead of a realignment, we've had instead a de-alignment. The idea being that, if realignments and this type of theory was sort of based on the idea that party political formation leads people to sort of have a set identification with one party, that de-alignment means that people have moved away from partisan loyalties. That if you ask people, well, how do you vote, people aren't likely to say, well, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat anymore. That far more people are likely to identify as independent voters. We can argue about whether or not that's happened, and whether or not people sort of say they're independent but really tend to vote for one party or another, or whether people really do switch alliances from one election to the next. It's worth noting in this conversation that it's a lot easier to be de-aligned now than it was, say, 100 years ago. And one of the most interesting things that I've seen a long time ago was, back in the days of, for example, Abraham Lincoln, it was impossible to do what we would call split ticket voting. Back in those days, you had, if you wanted to cast a ballot, you got a ballot, and you could either check one box to vote for all the Democratic candidates, or you would check another box to vote for all the Republican candidates. And there was no saying, well, I want the Republican president, and the Republican senator, but I like the Democratic representative for Congress. There was no way to do that. It was a straight ticket. Today, people are free to choose from one or the other and mix and match however they want. The other thing that's worth mentioning as we talk about de-alignments and realignments is whether or not we really rely on political parties the way we used to. Back in the days, if you sort of want to go talk to your grandparents or something like that, 60, 70 years ago, people got most of their electoral information from parties. It was the parties who would tell you who the candidates were, what they stood for. It was the parties who would pretty much vet and choose who would run for national office. And as a result, people tended to believe that parties stood for something, and if they were very committed to a cause, they would go and volunteer for a political party. Today, and this is more so now even than when I was in college or even when I taught 6 years ago, people get a lot more information for themselves. So people no longer rely on the party to tell them what's good for the country or even what's happening in the country. What that has meant is that we can now we are now better able to decide the merits of one candidate or another, one issue or another, and better able to decide which party or candidate is more likely to vote the way we would like them to than people were 70 years ago, when what you had was one party promoting a candidate as the best solution. I hope this has said a little bit about sort of what the relationship is between coalitions of interests and political parties, and that you've got a sense of sort of how the two can influence each other. In our next lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about sort of the campaign process and how that is very much changing as we speak, literally. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.